I'm Laura Flanders, and you're listening to The Laura Flanders Show, the place where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. To be or not to be intersectional, our future just may hang on understanding that concept. Find out how and why when Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, who coined the term, joins me in studio. And later in the show, Tarso Ramos of Political Research Associates on what sets the alt-right apart from other conservative factions. The answer might surprise you. Intersectionality. You'll find the word everywhere, from People magazine to the signs carried by marchers on the Women's March on Washington this year. It comes from a paper by the law professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, published over 25 years ago in a legal journal. She used it then to describe the intersecting effects of racism and sexism on African American women. Like a car in an intersection, black women get hit from multiple directions. Today, intersectionality's become a rallying cry. The New York Times called it, quote, the main point of rhetorical resistance against single-issue feminism. And it is quite possibly the concept that will catapult the struggle for justice in the U.S. and globally into a new chapter, or not. Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw is a tenured professor at Columbia and UCLA law schools and the founder and director of the African American Policy Forum. She's also my friend. Hi, Kim. Welcome back to the program. So just to start, you were described in the New York Times, an article by Amanda Hess, as the leading thinker around this question of intersectionality, and that question being the leading concept transforming our understanding of race, gender, social justice, and movement building. Must have felt pretty good, didn't it?
Well, you know, it's an interesting time now because, as you point out, the word intersectionality is on everyone's lips. So that's amazing. And at the same time, the way people are using intersectionality is, let's say, varied at best.
So give us some examples.
So there's some visions of intersectionality that just portray it as it's complicated. It's sort of it's intersectional, So basically it means no one explanation tells you everything you need to know. But a lot of times that's just the end of the conversation. I think the second thing that I've seen is the idea that intersectionality is basically identity politics on steroids. So first you have the negativity associated with addressing the politics of identity being reduced to a term, identity politics, that now functions kind of like political correctness. It's the thing that you don't want to be. And then you throw intersectionality in it, so it takes everything that's bad about identity politics and then complicates it by a factor of 1,000. Those aren't really the most productive ways of thinking about intersectionality at the moment.
What did you make of the way that the March on Washington handled some of these questions?
It was, again, another complicated moment because on one hand, it was important that a women's march actually show the connections between issues that face women as a group and issues around which women have specific kind of ways of experiencing it, but it's not traditionally seen as a women's issue, like immigration, for example. Not traditionally seen as a women's issue, but immigrant women who are undocumented have a whole range of risks and vulnerabilities associated being with a woman who's undocumented. So it was important to be able to address those kinds of issues at a moment when the actual frame was about women. So I thought that was great. But then there are other moments when I think folks kind of thought intersectionality was just about who's standing up there, not necessarily what they're saying. So you can be a woman of color, or you can be a queer woman and not necessarily have an intersectional analysis.
We have noticed that.
And you can be a white woman or a man of color and have an intersectional analysis. So it's one of the reasons why I stay away from the idea of you can tell if a movement or organization is intersectional just based on who's leading it. That's not always the case.
Big question. But if you were organizing, I don't know, a march tomorrow, how would you tweak it? What would you do?
Well, one of the things that I would do as I look at the different issues is think about how intersectionality shapes the issue, not who are we going to get to come and talk about it. So one of the campaigns that I've been involved in is the Say Her Name campaign. We've been trying to draw attention to Black women who have been victims of police violence. Say Her Name showed up at the march, but not in a particularly broadened way that one would expect. Mothers of the movement were there. That was an important thing to make sure that we understand that state violence is of significance to women, so that was important. But the mothers of women who were killed by the police were marching with us, and they weren't really speaking or featured. So what do we make of that? Number one, it was important to have all the ways that women are impacted by state violence, and so that was a step. But a further step is to think about how is state violence impacting women who are actually victims of state violence. So it's basically just closing, or I would say opening the vision so we don't have holes in how the issue is presented.
That's Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. I'm Laura Flanders. This is The Laura Flanders Show. Stay tuned.
It is time for the preachers, the rabbis, the priests, pundits, and the professors to believe in the awesome wonder of diversity. It is time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious, some thrive on comedy. Some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of our skin tone can confuse, amuse, delight. Brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas and stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man.
For more of The Laura Flanders Show, subscribe to our program and our podcast for free at lauraflanders.com. You just released a report that is a transcript of an extraordinary webinar that you hosted in the days after the election of last November. And you brought together 16 social justice experts. It's called Social Justice SOS. I encourage everybody who's watching, listening to this to check it out. The learning that your webinar afforded all of us was around exactly those issues. If we intersectional better, we would have understood how the votes happened. Mm-hmm. We would have understood how the issues were resonating or not in the media. We would have been able to anticipate white women's votes, for example, because it has to do with patriarchy more than the womenness of those voters. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about what that report models, if you will, if you think about it that way.
I woke up the day after the election in a daze, like many people did, and immediately started thinking, while we're in this moment, we need to be able to have a conversation about how we got here from all the different vantage points. So I called up people like Robin Kelly and Alicia Garza and Eve Ensler, Dennis Parker, Tim Wise, Devin Carbato, just some of the smartest people who represent a whole range of issues, from immigration to racism to police misconduct to voting, to actually come together and talk about what had happened. And it was an amazing conversation. I think we were able to move from moments in history when something like this has happened before, and I think we got a sense of what this could mean for the future. We were able to talk about various constituencies. We were able to talk about how a non-intersectional framing of class contributed to this moment. So the report is basically lifting up some of the most significant moments in the conversation, but I think also in reading the report, you get a model of what it looks like to think about this moment in terms of an intersectional framework.
So the class bit of it, for example?
Well, so, the most common frame now that you hear is this election was about class, not about race. This election was about losses suffered by the working class. Well, of course, if class was the same set of experience across all different groups, you wouldn't have had such a split between white men and black women. When we're talking about class, there's a class division right there. Obviously, what's happening is people are framing class in a singular biographic frame, basically white men. And they're not taking into account, in fact, even the effects that people are saying contributed to this are far more significant in the lives of black women, in the lives of people of color, loss of economic security, all of the things that people say contributed to it actually were happening among the people who voted the most against Trump.
Why do black women vote the way they do?
That's a class issue. It's a race issue. It's a gender issue. There's an awareness of vulnerability coming not just from a lost expectation. This is something that Tim Wise talked about. He talked about white nationalism having created a set of expectations about what is supposed to happen to me and what is not supposed to happen to me. And when certain things start happening that go against that grain, Luke Harris calls it diminished overrepresentation. You think you're supposed to have 100%, turns out you only have 90%. So that leads to the resentment, the anger, the righteous indignation. You have other people like black women. The expectation is always forward-looking. It's always, how's my life going to get better? It's not, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. So I think they just came into it with a very different set of expectations that then played out differently in the ballot box. That's the kind of thing that an intersectional analysis brings to the table.
Project yourself into the future, 50 years. Mm-hmm. How will the history of this moment get written, do you think?
Mm-hmm. I see two possibilities. The one possibility is the way we think back on the election of 1876. Election of 1876 was the backlash election against the first Reconstruction. It was the election that decided the future of African Americans for 7 decades. It was the election that led to the abandonment of the newly freed slaves. It led to the destruction of early efforts to create a public education system. It led to the disenfranchisement of millions of African Americans. It led to the fact that the first black senator that we had after that moment didn't happen until the 21st century. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can happen, a complete unraveling of the basic infrastructure of civil rights. So we could look back with that lens at this moment and say, it's not just the fact that Trump got elected. It's also the democratic response, the response of civil society, the response of media that tells itself that the reason why this happened was because we've been too deeply associated with social justice. And so the whole idea is that we have to move back to the right to retake the white voter. I don't want that to be the history, right? So I say that one to say, let's try to tell this story. Let's tell a story of it was finally recognized that our inability to talk directly and persuasively about the expectations that have been generated by a history of white supremacy, of class domination, of patriarchy, led us to a moment where we were easily divided. We can't do that again. So anything that feels like it's going back in the direction that we came from is obviously not the thing to do right now. So now we know we need to have better ways of talking across movements. We need to have better ways of building movement infrastructures that actually ask, how do we connect up? So I want to say that in 50 years, this was the wake-up call. This was the moment when we recognize that actually we do have a greater constituency than we think. We just now need to figure out how to be far more strategic and visionary about mobilizing these resources, mobilizing this energy. And we need to have expertise to help us do the jobs that we need to do to build the connections that are necessary. It's not just a word.
That was Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. And be sure to watch our show at lauraflanders.com for more, including Say Her Name, a video produced by the African American Policy Forum. Next up, Tarso Ramos of Political Research Associates on the alt-right and why it's so alt. Or is it? Stay tuned.
Let's make it better. Oh, yeah. Long as I'm alive, I'm gonna state my case. Singing my songs for the human race to get better.
You can get a copy of this week's show by subscribing to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or lauraflanders.com. Just go to the website for more information. And don't forget to rate us if you're enjoying the show. Thanks. Welcome back to the program, Tarso. Glad to have you.
Pleased to be here.
Just remind us what your mission is.
Political Research Associates is a human rights think tank that studies threats to democracy coming from various right-wing sources. And we do that in order to support social justice movements in the United States and a little bit internationally.
What makes the alt-right the alt-right? Is this just a repackaging of an old right, of a Christian theocratic right, or a anti-regulatory right? What's so alt about it?
The alt-right has white nationalism as its ideological core, but it's distinct from other white supremacist traditions in the United States, say the Klan or neo-Nazis. It's very carefully engineered, no backwards lineage to those groups. Instead, it draws from the U.S. alt-right, the original America Firsters, the anti-New Dealers. The other key part of the alt-right is all about misogyny.
Well, I was going to say, if you go back to Nazi times, we often forget the misogyny part of that picture. But if you look at the opposition to the New Deal, it very much targeted Eleanor Roosevelt and saw her as the insidious socialist, communist power behind the throne.
No question. And in many historical cases of the rise of authoritarianism, whether that's classical fascism or the kind of military dictatorship that drove my family from Brazil, misogyny and hyper sort of toxic masculinity is often a component of that. This distinguishes the alt-right in the United States from the Klan and the neo-Nazis, and really almost any movement of any duration comes to realize that without women as organizers, without women in leadership, they don't survive as a successful
So they often put up kind of conservative women and say, look, we don't oppose women's leadership.
Well, women do the work. You and I know that. Women do the work, including movement work. And that's true on the right as well as on the left. In the case of the alt-right, though, the hyper-misogyny of this manosphere, what's called this kind of right-wing misogynist gamer community.
They call it that?
Yes. This hyper-misogyny is far to the right on gender issues than the Klan or the neo-Nazis are, and they've influenced white supremacist culture to be increasingly misogynist. So the misogyny of this moment isn't just, the misogyny of now the Trump and the Trump regime and, the words of a serial sexual offender as president of the United States. It's actually part of far-right culture in the U.S. in a different way.
So how do people see this playing out in policy, and how close is the alt-right to the Trump regime?
Well, look, the alt-right, the white nationalist folks, they look at people like Steve Bannon, and Trump himself is not part of the white nationalist movement, not the alt-right. They call them the alt-light. But they recognize that they have provided a tremendous opportunity. They've popularized many of their ideas. And so just as Trump was constantly testing the limits, right, of acceptably offensive speech over the course, for instance, of his campaign, and is now testing that in terms of policy, the white nationalists are doing a similar thing. They're trying to see how far they can go. And in policy terms, though, I think we're also seeing it in the rise of militarism, right, within the Trump regime, which is a classic misogyny, a classic component of militarism. The placement of Steve Bannon as a permanent part of his national security team is an example of that and inevitable coming wars. But we're seeing it also in interesting other ways within the movement. So now you have neo-Nazi websites like the Daily Stormer that have banned women from posting anything on their sites at all, enforcing a kind of misogyny across the range of different white nationalist groups.
That's Tarso Ramos of Political Research Associates. I'm Laura Flanders, and this is The Laura Flanders Show. Stay tuned. As the Trump administration plays out, I suspect, if I were to make a projection, that the issues that most people on the left side of the spectrum come to focus on are issues of economics, Wall Street control, monopoly, trade, jobs. How does that piece of the Trump agenda intersect with what you've just described that has more to do with white supremacy, misogyny, and sort of obvious Nazi-esque tactics?
Well, look, as we saw all through Trump's campaign, he told a story that put the economic piece and the race piece in the same frame. So as people are trying to figure out, did people vote for Trump because of what he was offering in terms of jobs or because of the racism? It's hard to take those things apart because they were packaged together in a very coherent way. One of the things that we have not done very successfully as liberals, as progressives, as people on the left, is to talk about race and the economy and gender the way we actually live it in this country. Who's talking about the fact that for most white people in this country, racism has been economic suicide for the past at least 30 or 40 years? People are convinced to slash public spending on education, on social services, on healthy and human services, in order to deprive those things from people they think are undeserving, that defined in racial ways, and then wonder where their health care went.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Wonder where their wages went.
Cuts of Medicaid will actually undercut the programs that we're going to try to be used to combat opioid addiction.
Exactly.
In largely white communities.
Trump has already begun to betray many of the people who voted for him. And part of our job is to reveal that betrayal as quickly as possible so that we can mobilize more people to resist and advance an alternative to Trumpism. It's not just about saying no, it's about advancing the kinds of policies and solutions we know can work. The big winners in this election arguably were the white nationalists and the Christian right. But a couple of implications of this. These two forces are arguably the most misogynist forces on the right. The alt-right has infused the entire white nationalist movement with tremendous misogyny, and the Christian right embodies the traditional patriarchal attitudes of conservative Christianity and Catholicism. And so the rise to prominence of those parts of the right is particularly worrisome in terms of the prospects for gender equality in any fashion in this country right now.
And then there's the question of militarism, which you've mentioned. We can see it abroad in the kind of pro-war, pro-Wall Street agenda. But what about here at home in the United States and the messages that the Trump administration is sending to members of security forces, police administrations, police forces, sheriff's associations, and so on?
Trump made a big point all through his campaign, and he's making a point even now that he's been elected president, of meeting with right-wing sheriff's associations. These are people who are associated with armed citizen militias in places like Oregon. These are not just conservative sheriffs. These are folks who are part of a resistance movement, right, from the right. And he has signaled his intention to put tremendous money both into the military, into the Border Patrol in particular. So I think it's fair to say that he's shoring up the sectors of the Army and the domestic policing forces that he thinks will be most loyal to his agenda. At the same time, he's instructing the FBI to abandon looking at white supremacist groups as part of its program of countering violent extremism and making that program entirely about going after Muslims in this country.
And underfunding the Violence Against Women Act, if
and
not
underfunding the Violence Against
altogether.
Women Act. If anyone was concerned that police forces, federal, local, would have incentive to turn a blind eye when there's bystander or organized ethno-violence or gender-based attacks, like the Muslim women in New York thrown down subway stairs here, we have real reason to think that that will become policy, that it's becoming policy now before our eyes.
Even as they simultaneously eliminate the Violence Against Women Act and all those protections.
Exactly. And so I do think that the fact that the Women's March really kicked off this moment of resistance is quite appropriate and is an auspicious beginning in a moment where we're going to have to confront misogyny like never before. In this generation, in any case, of activists. Likewise, I think the quick move of the Trump administration with the Muslim ban, in retrospect, we might look at as a kind of gift because it was a test to our people, to our country, to our society, as to who would stand up for the most vulnerable and the most targeted. And I think the results have been incredible, incredibly heartening. These protests out at the airports around the country, the quick legal action to block the ban, I think that this is an auspicious beginning on both to resistance and to advancing alternatives.
That was Tarso Ramos of Political Research Associates, a human rights think tank that studies threats to democracy coming from various right-wing sources. And earlier in the show, I spoke with Professor Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw on intersectionality. Music featured in this week's program included Maya Angelou, Raul Midon, and Bacao Rhythm Steel Band. For more information on this week's show and to sign up for our free podcast, download transcripts or watch the program, go to lauraflanders.com and write to me. I'd love to hear from you. I take the time to read and respond to all of your emails. I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for joining me.